Thank you all. Thanks to JDP. Boy, do I wish there had been something like Jewish Voice for Peace when I was a young Jewish girl growing up in California. I didn't have anything like that. You know, Yusuf gave me some good ideas for a segue here when we're talking about the role of Congress and what's going on throughout the country. I think the key thing for members of Congress and for others who work in and around Congress is to recognize something that's relatively new on this issue. And we can debate whether it was ever true, but whether it was or not isn't so important now. But what's true now, it is not political suicide to criticize Israel. Let me say that again. It is no longer political suicide to criticize Israel. Many think it once was. We can debate that, it doesn't really matter. But now it pretty clearly isn't. We're in a very different world in this country. And there's a lot of reasons why. Some of it has to do with the things Yusuf was talking about the fact that there are now 650 illegal settlers in the occupied West Bank when there used to be, 100,000. You know, we can talk about all kinds of actions that Israel has taken over the years, but what's also changed is how we come to know about it. The media is completely different now. Not because the media necessarily wants to cover it all the way some of us think they should, but there's no getting around the fact that people throughout the West Bank have cell phones, and when they have electricity, on those rare occasions, one of the first things they do is power up their cell phone and send their video out into the ether. And we pick it up and we see it. So the dependence on a media system that has fairly consistently not wanted to cover this issue in a very clear and fair and balanced way is a very different media reality these days. So we understand things differently now. And what has changed has been the discourse, the political discourse in this country at the level of the academy, in the media, in education, in politics, among ordinary people, in faith-based communities, and crucially, particularly in the Jewish community. The discourse about Israel, Palestine, the occupation, is not anything close to what it once was. And that provides us with, on the one hand, enormous possibilities. On the other hand, enormous challenges. Because the biggest gap that we see now is not what it once was, the gap between the reality on the ground and how people in this country understand it. It's been a long time coming. It's been a long time coming. But we have made incredible progress in showing people in this country what the reality on the ground is. And far more people now have a very different view. I'll give you just one snippet of a poll. Now, I don't like polls very much. Polls are, at best they're a snapshot of a moment in time. But when you find a good poll, you always want to talk about it. So let me give you one snapshot. This is from the summer of 2010. Remember that summer? That was when there was apparently a big fight going on between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And there was all this sort of high-velocity press about, oh my God, President Obama is criticizing Israel. Oh my God, he's pressuring Israel. He's throwing Israel under the bus. Well, there was no bus. Nobody got thrown anywhere. There was a series of requests that were made by President Obama. Please stop building settlements. And the Israelis said, no, please stop this, no. And then the questions and the requests stopped. That's not pressure. We may think it's pressure because we so rarely hear even that, but that's not pressure. Pressure means stop building settlements. No. Okay, you're an independent country, you can do what you want, but that $3 billion in military aid we give you every year? You can kiss that goodbye. And you know how we protect you against any allegation in the United Nations? We're not going to do that anymore. That's what pressure looks like. We were not seeing that. But remember that summer, we were being told that the U.S. is putting enormous pressure on Israel. In the context of that summer, there was a Zogby poll, and the Democrats, everybody was asked the question, but I'm going to tell you the Democratic answer. The question was, Israelis are building settlements in the occupied West Bank. Which of the following two statements best reflects your view? So sentence number one is, Israelis are building settlements for security reasons and they have the right to build wherever they want. Sentence number two, Israelis are building settlements in the occupied territories that are illegal and they should all be torn down and the land returned to its original owners. Now that's a very drastic statement. It happens, in my view, to be a good reflection of what international law, in fact, requires. But it's a very powerful, really extreme, if you will, statement about what's happening in the West Bank. 63% of Democrats chose door number 2. I found that astonishing, but not surprising on one level, because of the work that's gone on to change how people see this conflict. And the big challenge we face is not that old conflict about the gap between how people understand it and what's actually going on. Now, we face a different gap that's going to make the work to change that one look like a picnic. The challenge we face now is the gap between the discourse in this country that is changing dramatically and fast and generationally, that's part of the equation, the gap between that and the policy, which has not changed. Why did the peace talks, the peace process, so to speak, collapse? Because it didn't ever reflect reality. It was never about an even-handed process. You know, when you bring a powerful actor that either, depending on whether you believe the CIA or the IMF, either the 23rd or the 26th wealthiest country in the world with the only nuclear weapons arsenal in the Middle East, backed by the world's sole superpower on one side, and on the other side, Palestinians with nothing, but you say, well, it's equal because they're both sitting at the same table. That's never going to work. It was never going to work. And lots of us who write about this stuff and talk about it ad nauseum, to ourselves, I mean, not to you, we all said it wasn't going to work. Why? Because it wasn't based on international law, human rights, and equality for all. That was never the US policy. And until it is, the policy isn't going to work, and it isn't going to match the discourse of what people want, what people expect. So let me just talk for a minute about what that discourse looks like. What's the evidence? You know, people say to me sometimes, you got evidence? What's your proof? Well, look at some of the books that have been published. Look at President Carter's book. I don't happen to think, frankly, between you and me, I don't think it's a great book. I think there's a lot of problems with the book. But 10 years ago, well now I think it's more, let's say 15 years ago, President Carter, ex-president or not, would not have found a US publisher prepared to publish a book in the United States with the word apartheid in its title talking about Israel, even though it poses it as a question and not as a reality. It simply would not have been possible. Suddenly, it was possible. You look at the question of the challenge to military aid. Military aid isn't really under challenge, as you all know better than us here in the Congress. Military aid is a given every year to Israel. The only question is how much? How much can we increase it? When we're cutting all the aid because of the sequester, Israel actually had the chutzpah to say we should be exempt. Really? We're cutting Head Start programs and your military aid should be exempt? You know, don't get me started on that one. But in that context, suddenly AIPAC, the most influential of the many pro-Israel lobby groups, started putting the question of military aid on their legislative agenda. I don't think they believe it's at risk, but they realize they have to provide members of Congress with talking points to justify it because more and more constituents are coming to those members saying, what's with this military aid stuff? We're cutting everything in this country. We're cutting food stamps. We're cutting education. We're cutting jobs. And yet we're giving $3 billion a year to the Israeli military? Every bit of it is military aid. It's not even economic aid. You know, and they're realizing they need to provide members of Congress with talking points. How do you answer that? That was an example of the discourse shift. If we look at what's happening in Europe, the US is way behind in this one. You know, we're seeing the major European banks refusing to deal with Israeli banks because they don't want to be accused of collaborating with violations of international law. We're seeing the boycott movement that Yusuf spoke of taking on new excitement here in the United States. So you have the academic associations, the Asian American Association, the Native American Studies Association, the American Studies Association, the biggest one, all taking on boycott positions. And now, crucially, you have the biggest denominations in the Protestant churches of the United States, the Methodists, who passed a resolution just a week ago divesting their millions of dollars from their various endowment funds from the G4S company in Israel, a company that is crucial to the Israeli prison system, that's involved in holding political prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, many with no charges. And you know what? That same G4S company is involved with the private prison movement in this country, the privatization of prisons that has created such enormous problems in terms of mass incarceration and other problems that you all deal with here, and that the commemoration today of the civil rights movement has yet to answer. So we see enormous shifting on that. We see a shift in the mainstream press. One other thing, the coverage in the New York Times, I'm not going to try and document it all, lots of it is still problematic, but we suddenly see access to the Times for Palestinian voices, for recognition of these violations in a whole new way. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one of the most important economic actors in our country's economy, has just decided to divest from G4S for the same reasons, because of their concerns about the violations inherent in the Israeli prison movement. And then the Presbyterians, I mentioned the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the largest single denomination of US Protestantism in this country, is saying, we will no longer invest in corporations, American corporations. These are not Israeli corporations. Caterpillar, Motorola Solutions, and HP. These are US corporations that they are divesting from, saying they are making a killing, in a word, from occupation. They are making a profit from occupation. That's not okay any longer. So the problem for members of Congress now is not the worry that, oh my God, if I criticize Israel, will I be accused of anti-Semitism? You know, some crazy people may accuse them of that, but that's not what's going on. The problem is if they don't, they are increasingly out of touch with their own constituencies. In the African American community, in the white community, in the Jewish community, in the Latino community, where there's collaboration going on about the building of walls and the companies that build walls to divide people and steal land in all those ways in the Israeli-Palestinian context and here in the US-Mexico border context. So finally, I just want to end with this sense of the change in the Jewish community. This is huge, and Joseph is going to talk about it more when I finish, but I just want to say one thing, which is part of it is generational. And I think this is what has brought real fear to organizations like AIPAC, like Stand With Israel, like others, whose job it is to defend the Israeli government's position, no matter what that position is, no matter how much it may violate international law, US law, or anything else. They are afraid because they know they're losing support in the Jewish community. They still have a lot of money. I would be lying if I said that members of Congress don't have to worry anymore about money that comes from those organizations on the condition that you toe the line on voting for Israel. But they no longer can come and say, we not only have money that if you don't toe the line, we're going to go fund somebody else to run against you. We're going to fund an opponent you may never even have heard of yet. The difference is they can no longer also say that we bring in votes from the Jewish community, because they don't. You now have an organization like Jewish Voice for Peace that is a major player in the Jewish movement and the Jewish community around this country, particularly among young Jews. You have J Street that played such an important role in breaking the taboo that said only AIPAC can speak for Jews in Washington. They're kind of in the center. Then you have AIPAC. These days, they're very akin to the Israeli government, which is as far right as there has ever been in all the Israeli governments there have ever been. But they no longer represent the vast majority of the Jewish community. My family, people that long identified AIPAC as speaking for them in Washington. There's a new voice out there. Jewish Voice for Peace is a big part of it, and there's lots of others. And the problem now facing members of Congress is how to bridge that new gap. Recognizing that the discourse has changed, the question every member of Congress should be asking is, what are you doing to join them?